Hello and welcome to On the Ledge podcast, late night edition. I'm Jane Perrone, your host, and this week we're talking tattoos. I'm joined by Dr Matt Lodder, tattoo expert and senior lecturer in art history and theory at the University of Essex, to find out all the things you need to know about the role of plants in tattoos. Before we get on to that, though, important announcement about On the Ledge. As you know, the show's been going for 7.5 years now, and I've been plugging away for all that time making episodes pretty much continually, barring maybe a month here or there. And I've decided it's time to take a sabbatical from the show. This will give me a chance to have a think about the future direction of the show. Obviously, I've started to incorporate more video into the show, which brings its own challenges. Also, I have a project that I'm working on that's taking up a lot of my time up till the end of this year. So, it felt like a good time to take a break from the show. Fear not though, there's a bit more to go before the break. So there's this episode you're about to listen to, then there is going to be a bonus episode which marks the launch of my audiobook of The Wild Garden by William Robinson. So I am joined in a bonus episode by a biographer of William Robinson to find out more about this chap and how he contributed to the way we garden today. That's coming up after this episode, and then the very final episode will be out probably in early September, and that will be another video episode. Yes, we're going video again for that one. That will be with Ben Newell, who is Worcester Terrariums, an amazing content creator and terrarium maker, finding out all about his work, his life, in a late night on the ledge style. So before I go, we're going out with a bang. And as I say, I'm not seeing this as the end for On the Ledge. It's a pause. When am I coming back? I hope it'll be at the end of the year. I will keep you posted as things develop and as I settle down into what I want to do next with On the Ledge. If you are a Patreon subscriber, I will have sent you a message already explaining this and telling you how this will affect your either monthly or annual payments. Basically, the Patreon will be paused. You'll still be able to access everything, but you won't be paying for the privilege of just waiting for me to return. And if you have any questions, as always, just drop me a line. Whether you're a Patreon subscriber or not, I'd love to hear from you. Patreon subscribers can get in touch via a direct message on Patreon, or you can drop me an email on theledgepodcast@gmail.com. Let's get on and enjoy this week's episode and find out more about how plants fit into the world of tattooing with Matt Lodder. Before we start, a quick reminder, this is a late night on the ledge episode. What does that mean? Well, it's a bit like a late night chat show where we might go a little bit off topic. We might use some swear words and discuss things that may be more sensitive and younger ears will not be wanting to hear. So bear that in mind as you start listening to this episode. And if you want to go and check out the archive, there's another 250 plus episodes for you to enjoy, which don't contain that kind of content. So that's your final warning.
Hi, I'm Dr Matt Lodder. I am a senior lecturer in art history and interdisciplinary studies at the University of Essex. I'm a historian of tattooing. I've just written, I wrote a book called Painted People, which came out in paperback back end of last year. And I'm working on another one right now. So yeah, really happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm just going to cut in and say that this is my I'm doing a late night kind of edition for this. So we are allowed to swear. Hooray! Because normally my podcast doesn't include swearing. But as somebody who swears quite a lot, we're allowed to swear. So if you need to swear about anything.
I mean, always.
It's the opportunity's there. Now, I feel very underprepared, not in the sense of I haven't read your book. I have read your book, but in the sense that I have no tattoos, as I discussed with you earlier. But yes, my husband did say that to me. He said, are you going to come back and say, I've got ink? So I don't think so, but maybe I'll be persuaded. So this is a fascinating topic. Everyone I meet who's into plants has interesting planty tattoos. But I guess what I want to know is, leaves and flowers, they've always been on tattoos, haven't they? But why is it that now and in the past they've been such a common motif? What is it that we love about these plants that we want to put them on our bodies?
Yeah, I mean, so talking about motif up top, I mean, flowers just make a good, there's a reason they're this kind of decorative staple in decorative art generally, right? Like we see flowers on, not just in contemporary culture, but in ancient cultures and culture all over the world. We see them on clothing, on pots, on jewellery, on furniture design. Yeah, they are a kind of decorative staple, a decorative staple, part of folk art imagery cross-culturally. Even planting flowers itself is a decorative act in many ways, right? So if you think about tattooing primarily, first and foremost, as a kind of decorative act, it kind of makes sense. There's this kind of continuity, I think I always want to say, between tattooing and the visual cultures it emerges from. In terms of actually like the kind of, if you want to get into sort of symbolism, I mean, I'm a little bit worried often about kind of over-determining meaning in tattooing. But, just like in fine art, flowers make good, quite basic, symbols for some of the most kind of profound concerns and joys of human life, right? Like they're symbols of hope and of fertility and of new beginnings. But they're also, if you think of Dutch flower painting as a good example, they're good symbols of, the fragility of life, the kind of memento mori, right? Flowers bloom and give beauty and joy, and then they wither and die, and then they're kind of recycled. So they become these kind of quite basic, quite fundamental symbols in art generally for mortality. And of course, that as I always want to say, if you want to be an art historian and you want to read things into people and places and cultures and times from the art that's in museums and churches, you must also be able to do that probably in a particular way for the art people wear on their bodies. And so, we find flower tattooing working as memento mori, as symbols of love, just as you'd give someone a bunch of flowers to symbolise you were thinking of them. All those kind of things, all those very basic human desires, drives, worries, concerns are kind of articulatable, let's say, through floral motif, right?
I'm always amazed by the ingenuity of people who have tattoos done. The preparation that goes into thinking about the meaning of something, the meaning of a plant, where they're putting it on their body, how it fits in with their existing tattoos. This is something that people are really engaged with as an artistic process.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a lot of the time, certainly in the contemporary Western culture, like the decorative impulse comes first. I want a tattoo, and then the kind of meaning emerges from that over time. I mean, there's a nice example. There's this incredible Australian, she's actually Irish-Australian, this performance artist called Sandra Minchin Delaunay. About 10 years ago, probably even more than that now, she actually had a full copy of Jan van Heem's flower painting back piece done. Her whole back turned into this kind of still life flower painting, and that takes some commitment and thought. But she got a grant from the I think it was the Australian Arts Council. She was doing a PhD in fine art in Melbourne, and the idea was she'd turn her body basically into a still life, and then to really push this kind of memento mori artistic kind of comparison, she decided she'd donate her. Eventually, when she passed away, she'd donate her skin to a museum to be, become an artwork. So her her death, her rebirth could be like actuated through turning herself into an artwork in quite a deliberate way. So, I mean, most people don't go that far, but I think the symbolisms there that she's playing with in that piece are certainly, something on those lines are happening in all tattoos if you want to read them in that way, right?
I worry for some people that they're going to get some rare house plant tattooed on their body, and then the plant's going to die. Maybe then that's the way of keeping it alive ad infinitum, because, lots of plants do die on you. Some people have these tattoos done, and then perhaps it lasts longer than the plant. I don't know.
I'm sure they will do, right? Like the kind of the joke. There was one tattooer, this guy called Samuel Stewart, who in a book that he wrote back in the 90s, basically said, tattoos last for life plus 6 months. Your tattoo's on you forever, and then for a bit long as it rots away in the ground. So I mean, I'd hope unless I'm sure there definitely are plant species that will last longer than the human lifespan, but like I'm sure if you're pretty easier to keep a plant on your body alive than it is to certainly if you're me with my kind of what's the opposite of green thumbs, black thumbs? I don't know. Yeah,
I mean, we all kill plants. That's the bottom line. But I can see how immortalising them on your skin is one way of keeping that memory alive, perhaps a plant that you've lost. But this brings us to a question that was answered reading your book, but perhaps you could share with listeners, is how do you actually go about researching this stuff? Because in the book you go way back into the history of tattooing, but obviously before the age of photography, how do we know what people were putting on their bodies, bearing in mind that bodies rot away, skin deteriorates?
It is a difficulty, and actually most of my sort of hardcore academic research is in the Victorian and like Edwardian periods, or the 19th and 20th century, let's say. So I had generally sort of skirted that issue in some senses. But I have friends and colleagues and other people who work on kind of ancient tattooing, and some skin does survive in either naturally preserved. So the oldest tattoo specimens we've yet found are 5,500 years old. They date back to the late Copper, early Bronze Age. Naturally preserved when their bearer, a man who's now called Otzi the Iceman, kind of died in the Austro-Italian Alps. No flowers on him, unfortunately. He's just got some tally marks on him. Or they're preserved. The other, cold is one way to preserve them. Another way to do it is like dry preserving, mummification, basically. And there are naturally preserved mummies from pre-dynastic Egypt from around the same age, so 3,500 years BCE, 5,000 years ago, which were men and women who died naturally in conditions that has meant that their bodies survived through to the present. Also, I'm trying to think. There's a female specimen at the British Museum called the Gabeline woman, this sort of Sudanese Nubian woman, and she has tattoos on her. They're not directly floral, but some academics have kind of interpreted them as such. So there are these kind of ancient skin preservation techniques. I mean, for me, actually, the really difficult thing is not the fact that tattoos are recorded in photography or in record keeping. So even in the periods that I look at, there's things like criminal description ledgers, sailor description books, enlistment cards, descriptions in newspapers, things like that. But that's obviously only ever going to be a very, very small proportion of the kind of tattoos that were done. Quote unquote average people were not having their bodies recorded. So if you go looking for, let's say, criminal tattoos, or let's say you're looking for tattoos in the history of tattooing in the archive, you will find sailor tattoos and criminal tattoos most easily, because they're the people that had their bodies recorded for people to come and look at in future. And it's much harder to kind of unpick from those records, where we have records, what the broader picture is. So it's a constant challenge. But I think what's been the challenge of my research career has been trying to pay attention to that, what I call the archival lens, figure out what's missing, what could be missing, and even what does this surveilled data set tell us. These people come into the system as criminals and sailors, but perhaps their tattooing is indicative of some broader facet of their life, and they're not reducible to that mark on their body, right?
And is it as is the case with the Victorians in many senses, that there was a lot that was hidden in that you'd have people that were unexpectedly tattooed that would never be shown.
This is exactly the problem, and it's and the joy of it is, and even, I mean, this comes right up even to the, I have a lot of conversations with people, born in the post-war baby boom, and who say there were no tattoos when I was a kid, and I was like, I mean, there was definitely fewer than today, but there was a lot of tattooing, but not a lot of it was happening on hands and faces. People weren't wearing shorts and T-shirts to work. So, yeah, loads and loads of tattooing. And the majority of tattooing in the Western world has been underclothing. And so, so even people that were tattooed, so a good example, Edward VII, tattooed in Jerusalem, Easter, April 1862. No images of his tattoos have yet been discovered because in his official portraits and in even his family portraits, he's not rolling his sleeves up to show his tattoos. So much is happening under clothing, and that makes it really difficult. The other interesting wrinkle, and I haven't really started looking into this properly, but it's based on some work that was done fairly recently, is that also a lot of tattooing doesn't show up in early photographic techniques. So in wet collodion photography, if you've ever seen a lot of those wet collodion prints, they tend to make things a lot darker. They tend to make bright colours dark because they can't, and skies are often very dark because that process, as I understand it, can't represent blue properly because the process filters out blue. And of course, lots of certainly kind of early 19th century of the time amateur tattoos would have been more or less blue by the time they'd healed. And so they're just, even if you had photographs of these people, they're not going to show up. There was some interesting work by a guy in New Zealand who was noticing that this particularly applied to, for example, men who had facial mock or traditional Maori facial tattooing, which just didn't show up in photography. So, we've got all this problem, the physical, the archival, the documentary, and then as well, the sort of social stigmatic as well, which makes this stuff just really kind of disappear, So it's made it very challenging. One of the things really that's become easier over the course of my career is that more stuff is digitized, more stuff is accessible, and even stuff that is not digitized, it is easy to find out where it is. So even if I have to travel to go and see it, and spend a lot of time negotiating with archivists and librarians, I know where it is, and that kind of work just wasn't possible in the pre-digital era.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, plants obviously have been the subject of tattoos, but there are also certain plants that have been involved in the actual process of tattoos. Let's get into this because this is fascinating stuff. I, as somebody who hasn't been tattooed, I guess have a very basic understanding of what's even happening in modern tattooing. But I imagine in history, there's been lots of different ways of getting a pigment into somebody's skin.
Yeah. So the basic process is pretty straightforward and hasn't changed for forever. So the oldest tattoos we have are 5,500 years old. The estimates from paleoanthropologists suggest that tattooing is at least 45, could be 100,000 years old. So, but the basic technology is make a wound in your body somehow, and that's deep enough to hit the dermal layer. So your skin's got 3 layers. You need to hit the middle layer because that's where the immune system works in the way that preserves tattoos. Get some pigment in there, let it heal, and you'll have that mark on you forever. And of course, a huge amount of plant material has been involved in making that happen, right? So in a couple of ways. The first is pigments. Maybe we can start talking about pigmentation. Like the oldest tattoo ink recipe that we have was from the 6th century BCE from a Roman physician called Itus of Amida. And this is basically 1 pound of Egyptian pine bark, 2 ounces of corroded bronze ground with vinegar, 2 ounces of gall nut, which is with insect egg deposits from trees, and then 1 ounce of vitriol, so iron sulfate. So this mix of mineral and botanic, charcoal basically to make ink. Most basic traditional and ancient preserved tattoos are black, and they are made from carbon, often from soot or from lamp black or from just ashes. But in some particular cultural traditions, there was a particular kind of plant or a particular process to make that ink, if you like, right? The other really interesting wrinkle here, you may have heard this about woad and the ancient Britons. So Julius Caesar, when he came to Britain, Britain, by the way, the name for Britain, which is one of the books called Painted People, one of the kind of predominant theories linguistically is that it means something like land of the painted people, people of the forms, from a kind of Proto-Celtic word. And Julius Caesar basically describes seeing these people who were coloured in Latin, coloured blue with what Caesar records as vitrum in Latin. And vitrum had traditionally been translated as woad, this blue flowering plant. And for centuries, pushing on millennia now, there was this idea that the ancient Britons, the warriors, from the south and from Kent all the way up into Scotland, and where the Pictish tribes lived, were tattooing their bodies with woad, with this pigment made from this blue flowering plant. And like lots of lines of evidence have sort of started in the last sort of 20 or 30 years have started really debunking that idea. So number one is just basically we found some Iron Age bog bodies, and they had pigment on their bodies, not in their bodies. They were preserved, but they had a clay layer on their body decoratively rather than having tattoos in their skin. So there's a suggestion that actually this wasn't tattooing at all. It was just a kind of war paint, if you like. The Romans knew about tattooing. They used it for punishing slaves, and it was known from some of their neighbouring tribes. But essentially, we have this like 2 millennia long sort of game of telephone, if you like, where Caesar says, "Yeah, they're painted with vitrum." So no tools have been found. Some archaeologists have argued that various kind of compacts of needles and things were used for tattooing, but they seem to more likely be things like net making and stuff like that. Difficult to tell them apart. But when it comes to the botanical stuff, like there's some argument that actually vitrum doesn't actually mean woad. It actually means kind of glass. It's the same word is used in Latin for glass, and it might be a kind of a mineral glass that's blue in colour, rather than woad. And they haven't found evidence even that woad was cultivated or grown in Roman or pre-Roman Britain. It's complicated lines of evidence. There are some people that say that we found some indigo woad seeds. I'm sure some of your listeners will know more about this than I do. But essentially, one little linguistic translation and a kind of maybe misunderstanding by Roman sources has led to centuries of misunderstanding. And those Roman sources about the woad and about the ancient Britons and the painted people became kind of the staple way that early Britain, early modern and even kind of late medieval Britain antiquarian historians thought about themselves. They understood themselves to be the inheritors of the legacy of the painted people, that we were the kind of tough painted barbarians. And that persisted, right up to the moment when the New World was encountered by Columbus and others. There was this, there were tattooed people discovered in the Americas, and Europeans basically said, "Oh, they're a bit weird. They're painted, they're tattooed, they're marked, but don't worry, our ancestors were just like that." So this mistranslation of a potentially botanical term, or argued mistranslation of a potential botanical term, has led to millennia of cultural identity formation in a way that I think is really interesting. I know you do this with flowers, right? Like, we're not just talking about flowers. I'm not just talking about tattoos. I'm talking about what these things can tell us about all kinds of other things. Yeah, absolutely.
And I also seem to remember from the book, or from your talk, you did a talk at the Linley Library on this topic, that you were also talking about, am I right in thinking cactus thorns being used as a means of what's the word? Piercing the skin.
Yeah. So I mean, there's plenty of other kind of pigmented plants from around the world. Maybe we can come to those too. But like when it comes to tools, yeah, like again, you need something sharp, and often that's, in the Bronze Age, that seems to have been likely to have been bronze needles. In some cultures, it's animal bone, but in some places, it is basically spiky plants, and we have good evidence, right, of for example, in the I need to get this right. What they're called the basket maker 2 culture from Utah, or what is modern day Utah, for example, like discovered like 2,000-year-old tattooing tools that are basically cactus spines bound to a yucca haft in order to create the needle complex, in order to put the ink in. And there's lots and lots of kind of analogues for that kind of thing around the world. Like in my book, there's a story about tattooing in Fiji, where it's a primarily female practice done by women on women. Although my book tells a story of a woman called Adi Lebaleba, this young Fijian woman tattooing this curious European anthropologist, Baron Antonale von Hugel, who started the Museum of Anthropology in Cambridge, with their traditional tooling, which is made from lemon thorns. So they would again strap or tie lemon thorns to a haft. A lot of traditional tattooing is done in many cultures, particularly in the Pacific, is done with what we call hafted tools. So it's a long handle with the needles at a right angle to it, and you tap it, and you end up with this basically sort of bouncing motion, which moves the ink stained, pigment stained needle tip in and out of your body. And actually, I think these kind of tools also give us a sense of how cultural traditions of tattooing might have begun, because one can imagine, not pricking your finger or pricking your arm on a cactus spine, getting some dirt or a speck from the fire into that wound, it healing up and never disappearing, and you go, wait a minute, that we could use that, right? And you can see over time, over millennia, how things that happen almost sort of accidentally as part of the general process of being alive in a spiky world, can lead to the development of these techniques, right?
Yeah, well, I can testify to that, having been many, many times attacked by various succulents, both my own and visiting gardens. It is, I can see that. I mean, I guess this is one of the reasons why I fear. I guess my pain tolerance is basically zero. That's probably why I haven't got any tattoos. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that there's a whole chat to be had about tattoos, pain, whole process.
Well, when Europeans started writing and documenting tattooing in, for example, Tahiti, so there's this kind of myth that tattooing was discovered in the Pacific by Captain Cook and Captain Cook's fleet, which is absolutely 100% not true at all. As I said, antiquarian Britons knew about ancient tattooing. There was a huge tradition of pilgrimage tattooing from the late 1500s. There was tattooed peoples from the Americas coming to Britain and Europe from the late 1400s all the way through. So tattooing itself wasn't new, but the particular kind of practices and rituals and social meanings of tattooing in places like Tahiti and New Zealand and Fiji were new. And when English and French and German writers were talking about tattooing, a lot of tattooing in places like Fiji, where tattooing is, as I said, a female practice, it's done on young women as a kind of marker of adulthood, basically, as a kind of transition into adulthood. And the local population, the local tattooers, were just amazed that these Europeans were so horrified, because they're like, look, this is a tiny little child. Is fine, is hardcore, and taking this. What are you worried about? And that became a bit of a kind of interesting sort of moment of cultural difference, where Europeans were mocked even for kind of thinking that this was such a horrible and unpleasant thing, because they'd all done it themselves and been fine, right?
Tell me about some of the other plants involved in the sort of the whole pigment business? I mean, I
Yeah.
guess it must have been localized as according to what was actually growing in the vicinity, and therefore quite different in different continents and countries.
Yeah, that's right. So there are all these kind of local traditions. I think like the most kind of specifically ritualized one is perhaps this practice that comes from New Zealand. So. And from the Pacific in general. So, for example, this practice in New Zealand is called tamoko, and it's a practice of with sort of deep and specific cultural significance, which I'm not qualified to actually adequately explain. So please, if you're interested in this, go and read stuff written by Maori anthropologists who know about this. But in terms of kind of the actual practice, the physical details of the practice, I can of course tell you about. So part of the ritual to create tamoko is to use a pigment container made from a hinau tree. Is that how that's pronounced? Aleocarpus dentatus, maho, which is whitey wood, poporo, black nightshade. That's all mixed together. You have this kind of container, which is made from essentially a kind of coconut or some kind of big seed, and you mix all of these plants and berries and pieces of kind of medicinal herbs up to make this pigment, and then it ends up being the pigment that you would use in order to make your pigment. There'd often also be this kind of mixture of what's called kauri gum, which is a kind of this really. I was reading about this. I didn't know anything about this. Again, maybe your listeners know about this. But this is a kind of almost like a sap that is almost like amber. And it's very, very valuable. It can be found in these enormous clumps if you're lucky, and they're very, very valuable because it's this kind of long process of sap formation. This kauri gum, and that gets mixed with soot from burning white pine and ends up being part of the process. There's also this, kind of interesting practice in Samoa. Where in Madagascar, this is the Madagascan stuff, which is made from like crab apples or cashew apples, basically. So the apple that the cashew nut grows in, which grow in Madagascar, that was used to make tattooing for make ink for facial tattooing there. Also, you get those needles made from the spines of the Madagascar palm, mixed with sugar and charcoal with the juice of the cashew apple, and afterwards treated with plant medicine, including poultices from the monkey pod tree. Oh. So you have this kind of, complete kind of circuit, I suppose, of tool, pigment, sort of folk medicine and magic, and then actual practical disinfectant and healing properties all coming together to kind of ritualize and create this important practice.
It's fascinating stuff. And I guess the interesting thing about social media and globalization is that now these very specific practices like moko, I mean, the reason why I know about it is through the guy from the band Alien Weaponry, who's on TikTok, who talks a lot about his moko.
Yeah.
And so I knew nothing about it until I heard him talking about it on TikTok. The meaning to him and, answering people's questions direct from somebody in that culture. Yeah,
I mean, I think so. So a lot of these traditional indigenous practices were wiped out or nearly wiped out by colonialism. So the ones encountered first by colonial genocide and massacre, so tattooing practices in the Americas, particularly in Inuit populations, were almost wiped out by the late 1700s, and recovering and learning about those histories has been very, very difficult. The practices in the Pacific, for example, in New Zealand, they were severely curtailed by colonial colonization, but they did survive, and they were sort of adequately and well documented. And so, come the kind of moment of real post-colonial energy in the late 80s, early 90s and onwards. And new generations of artists have been rediscovering and reinventing these practices. And of course, it's probably not a good idea with modern health laws and standards to be tattooing yourself with or each other with cactus spines anymore. So these practices have adjusted and modernised in order to use modern inks and modern machines and modern tools, or even where hand tools are used, replaceable needles made from metal. So these traditions aren't kind of cast in aspic. They are kind of changing and being updated by the practitioners who are using them. I think it's really interesting. I had a really interesting conversation with a Maori tattooer recently on my own podcast, Te Rangitu, who made this point, right? It's like, just because that Maori culture gets to have a present as well as a past.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. We shouldn't kind of romanticize Indigenous practices as being timeless. And so, certainly with kind of modern activism and modern revival movements, these practices are being updated and changed. But of course, the kind of the basic kind of magic and the basic kind of meanings are embedded in the practice. And actually, although it's important, and these particular kind of pigments and tools have a kind of significance, that you're not getting they're not getting anything any less authentic if they're doing it with a machine.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, I guess, it was always the case that presumably people getting a tattoo were influenced by things in their own country, but also things from far away. But now, in the age of the internet, I'm guessing that the speed of evolution of tattoo design, you must get people coming into a tattoo studio saying, I've seen this Korean tattoo that I really like and want. How is that affecting the industry and the resulting tattoos? Yeah,
I mean, I've just written a book that's going to be coming out later this year. Hasn't got a finalised title yet, otherwise I'll be pitching it hard. But keep an eye on stuff for the book. And it's very difficult to talk about tattooing with any like Western. When I talk about tattooing, I'm really, unless otherwise specified, talking about modern Western, non-culturally normative tattooing, right, of the kind that we see around us. So it's very difficult to talk about tattooing after about 2000, because by that point, as in culture more generally, like everything's already been invented. So there are, prior to that period, prior to 2000, we have more or less clearly identifiable trends and moments and individuals or small groups of people who are influencing the industry. Like post the internet, basically, everything is possible. So there are, there are certainly trends and fashions, but it's so diffuse now. There are just incredible tattooers everywhere now in a way that just wasn't true until fairly recently. But it's much harder to kind of identify anything that's really kind of novel stylistically, or really kind of different in a way that a previous generation's tattoos were different from what had gone before. I mean, you mentioned Korea, though. That should be said. Like at the moment, Korea's really interesting. Tattooing's illegal in Korea. There was a court case parallel to the court. There was a court case in Japan that I was very, very tangentially involved with, which tried to make tattooing illegal in Japan, and that failed. The argument was tattooing is more like a medical practice because it's done with needles than it is an artistic practice, and therefore should only be done by doctors. That argument failed in Japan, but the same argument went to the Supreme Court in Korea, and the decision went the other way. So in Korea, tattooing is officially a medical practice, and to officially do tattooing in Korea, you have to be a doctor, and of course, that is not the case. That said, there's loads of incredible tattooers in Korea. They just sort of work not exactly underground, but sort of slightly kind of under the radar, and lots of them are moving to Europe and America, where it's easier to work. And a lot of the tattooists from Korea are really working in this floral style. There's a kind of huge, I can't even name any individuals because there's so many, huge really range of tattooers who are drawing on botanical illustration, for example, for their source material and producing incredible work. I mean, actually, that said, botanical illustration in terms of kind of designs have been source material for tattooers for a long time. Literally cutting and sticking things out of encyclopedias and out of magazines, out of sort of even adverts for plants, and using them as design books. And so, yeah, that's nothing new either. But yeah, lots of really nice, interesting tattooers from Korea right now. Although probably if anyone's listening wants to get a Korean tattoo, I'd say like New York or LA, like Koreatown in LA is probably the best place to get a good tattoo from a Korean without risking, the wrath of the Korean authorities coming in, kicking the door down while you're getting tattooed.
More from Matt shortly, but a quick info point during this break. I've had a few people asking me about Legends of the Leaf, getting hold of a copy in the US. I was disappointed. I mean, that's an understatement. I was gutted that the publishers decided not to distribute the book in the US and North America more generally. And what I'm hoping to do is get the rights back to the book and be able to self-publish the book globally in the future. That hasn't happened yet, but as soon as it does happen, I'll let you know. In the meantime, if you are an American and you still don't have a copy and you fancy getting your hands on one, I can sell you a copy directly. If you do that, then you get your own words. If you want to give it as a gift or you want a special message put in there, I can do that for you. So get in touch with me direct if you want a copy of the book. Worth saying that the self-published version will not be quite the same as the original. It won't have the foiled cover. It'll probably be slightly less fancy, but it will have all the illustrations in it. So if you do want the original copy and you haven't got one yet, whether you're in the UK or elsewhere, actually, I can sell you one directly. So get in touch if you want that to happen. I will sign it, I'll write in it, whatever you need me to do. And I also tend to stick in the odd sneaky little postcard as well. So you get an extra bonus for ordering direct from me. So just drop me a line if you're interested in that. And now back to Planty Tattoo Chat.
I also wanted just to ask, when you meet people, obviously going about your business and your research, you must see a lot of tattoos. Did you, when you were doing the Lindy Library talk, did anyone who did you have any tattooed members of the audience who were like, hey, look at this?
Disappointingly, I didn't actually. I was really hoping there'd be lots of kind of like secretly tattooed kind of, grande dame who had things hiding away. If there were any, they didn't show me any. I almost had the opposite problem. I was... So this, one of the points I always want to make about is what's going on underneath clothing. And seeing as this is the late night version of the podcast, I can tell this story. I work. One of the tattooers who I write about a lot is a guy called Mr. Sebastian, who was the main tattooer to the sort of gay scene in London in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of his clients, you wouldn't know they were heavily tattooed if you saw them in their admittedly baggy 1980s, but in their pants, right? They were completely not tattooed, but under their underpants, they were covered, and I mean covered everywhere. And so I had a photo earlier in my talk to try and articulate this point in the most kind of interesting way possible of a man who had a rose tattooed literally around his bumhole, like around his sphincter, beautifully rendered, detailed. Red and green rose, because I thought this makes the point, of like what's going on underneath clothing. And I said, "Can I show this in the RHS Lindy Library?" And they were like, "No, you can't. You can't do that."
I mean, I have a practical question about this. Surely that's the most sensitive part of your body.
There are more sensitive parts, but he also tattoos those. So
do you have to be under sedation for these?
Well, I think there are rumours that he did occasionally use anaesthetic on his clients, but I think for a lot of his clients the pain of it or the sensation of it, let's put it that way, was part of the,
Right.
part of the process.
That's amazing.
But yeah, so yeah, I I was hoping that discussion would reveal, what was happening in the room, but alas.
Wow. Well, I mean, I guess if you're going to have a tattoo somewhere, then,
I've put all of your listeners like driving or like heading off to bed or having their dinner. I've really put them off. Sorry.
Well, I just think that's fascinating. The idea, I say my pain tolerance. I say this as somebody who has given birth to a child with no pain relief.
Yeah,
so I did pass out, but I should say that possibly I'm underestimating myself. But well, that is fascinating. And so, how do you know about this tattooist? If it was all very kind of, was it? How was that documented in the 80s and 90s?
He was a really amazing guy. He was an art teacher actually, originally, and he quit being an art teacher to become a tattooer and a body piercer. He was also the first kind of real kind of professional body piercer in England, like one of the real pioneers of body piercing. And yeah, he was sort of known about, and people knew who he was. He tattooed in Mount Pleasant, in the middle of London. Died in the early 90s. But I knew some people who he had tattooed, and I also knew through a friend of a friend the person who had acquired his archive, if you like, all of his kind of portfolio photography. So I was able to go and have a word with that guy, and he let me photograph it all. And it's now actually, I managed to that man Jeremy sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but on his death he donated that collection to the Bishopsgate Institute, the kind of library of London life, near Liverpool Street Station. So all of his stuff is in there. So if any of your listeners want to go and look at these, you can go and peruse his portfolio.
Wow.
At your heart's content. He's a subject of a chapter in my book as well, so you can read about him in the book. Or there was actually a separate book, which is probably a bit hard to get hold of now, with a lot of these photos in. But I think his life's a really interesting example of a lot of the things I talk about, because he's this kind of middle class guy, in a way that, hilariously, the first time he shows up in the press, it's as a customer of another tattooer, and he's interviewed as part of an article, who's kind of in the 1970s, whose kind of argument is like, you're never guessing, school teachers are getting tattooed now, right? And like, this is the guy they interview. But he's a good illustration of all kinds of things. So, lots going on in his clothing. He's very, very educated. It's also a kind of community, which I think turns out, and more of this in the next book, is a really important part of tattooing's history, both in the UK and in Europe and in America, the kind of gay men, which isn't really documented, although people in the scene who've been around for a long time sort of know about it a bit. And yeah, it's, as I said, it's a perfect illustration of you never know what's going on underneath clothing. And it's beautiful, and it's funny, and it's weird, and it's also an insight into the lives of people whose lives generally don't get talked about in this intimate detail, right? Like, as you said, like who are these men who, in like 1990, early days of the HIV epidemic, or early days of the kind of end of the HIV epidemic, if you like, are getting like flowers tattooed on the most intimate parts of their bodies. Why are they doing that? Like, what does that tell us about what we thought was happening in that period of time? A lot of the writing, for example, about that moment in time in London is very bleak and sad, as it should be, but there's also this joy and humour and sex and these things that tattooing, as I said, and I will swear as well, if you don't mind now, like, I always say the things people tattoo on their bodies are basically the things they love, the things they hate, and the things they want to fuck. And maybe the third one is a subcategory of the other two, right? And like, that is really, in many cases, what tattooing is reducible to. It's true of art in general, right? It's like, there's not a lot of tattooers have tried to do kind of complex conceptual tattooing, but ultimately it's this very kind of base symbolic folk art which communicates extreme basic emotions of love, belief, faith, hope, fear, anger, sexuality, all these sort of very, very basic underlying human emotions. And it's no surprise that they're kind of indexed in this way through tattooing.
Well, I mean, if we can get personal now, this brings us on to your own tattoo. Now, I was going to ask you, I can see you've got a rose on your neck. So
I've got quite a few,
you've got some. I mean, for you, tattooing must have a whole level of mindfulness in that it's your career, it's an academic interest, but it's also on your own body. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, it became people sort of say, how did you as an art historian get interested in tattooing? It was the other way around. I started off interested in tattooing from very, very young, and art history became a way of kind of articulating and thinking about all of these things we've been talking about, right? And so initially when I did my PhD, and I hadn't done any art history before, I wanted to think about like what it meant to be an artwork in the world. What would it, if tattooing is an art form, like what is the kind of consequences of thinking that way about yourself as an artwork? And 20 years on after starting that work, I haven't quite got an answer to that question yet, because it turns out that very basic question of like, how is tattooing like art, is quite complicated. We use that term body art quite straightforwardly. It's been used for a very long time, and again goes back to those Roman sources. They were talking about bodies that were depicta sui pincta, sculpted and painted bodies. So these metaphors of art, when it comes to marking the body, are very, very old. But of course, there are lots of things about tattooing which don't really fit with art, right? Like we can't buy it and sell it. We can't hang it on the wall. As you said, it has this kind of durational limit. People don't see it or experience it in the same way. There's if tattooing is an art form, like, who is the artist? Is it the person on whose body it is? And that's been the argument for a long time. Is it the person who does the tattoos? Is it some combination of them both? How does this fit, as I go into the book as well, into like legal arguments about copyright and ownership and creative genesis of ideas? It's very, very complicated. So, I started out with what I thought was quite an interesting set of questions a long time ago, and I'm still kind of excited to answer them and think about them every single day, which is a real treat. I've got a lot of tattoos. So the roses, again, they're very classic, like folk art designs, because they also get to be the duality of life. You get the petals and the thorns. Every rose has its thorns, said the great poet laureate Bret Michaels of Poison. So again, those floral designs get to be kind of implicitly meaningful, even if you don't intend them to be, and they become kind of the vernacular language of tattooing in a really particular way. So I've got quite a few flowers, actually. I've got flowers on my hands, or kind of representations of floral designs on my hands. I've got a vase of flowers. I'm going to strip now for the listeners. I'll show you later on. I've got a vase of flowers up here. All kinds of little bits and pieces. Yeah, because they just work. They fill the space. They're gentle. I'm a lover, not a fighter. Right, I got the top of my head tattooed recently. I've grown my hair back since, but I went to Japan on doing some research, putting out some really interesting designs from Japan from the turn of the 20th century. Very interesting kind of culturally hybrid images of Western and Japanese designs. And I was chatting to a tattooer who was going to tattoo me, and he was like, "Oh, I want to just do this on the top of your head," and we were going to do this big eagle. And I'm not tough enough to get a big eagle on the top of my head. I'm a soft-handed academic. So I got a little chrysanthemum and a little sparrow, like coiled around the top of my head in a sort of crown shape. So even the gentleness and the kind of romance and the kindness of floral tattooing I really like. I've got some tougher tattoos as well. I have got a few more kind of more traditionally aggressive things on me, but as I said, I'm a lover, not a fighter, right?
Well, it's been a delight to talk to you, Matt. I've learned absolutely loads, and I'm sure so many listeners are going to have been absolutely mesmerised by this chat. It's been really fascinating. So thank you very much for joining me.
So much. It's a real pleasure.
Oh my days, I absolutely loved that chat with Dr Matt Lodder. I highly recommend you read his book, Painted People. I'll stick a link in the show notes for that. And do check out his own podcast, Beneath the Skin. And there you'll find loads more fascinating information about the world of tattoos. As always, check out the show notes for the full transcript and more. And if you are a Patreon subscriber at the legend or superfan level, there is a chunk more chat that happened after we said goodbye and thank you. There's about 10-15 minutes more chat where I talk about what I would have as a tattoo, and Matt explains the link to crufts and tattoos, and some more fascinating stuff. So go and check that out if you're a Patreon subscriber. Patreon is linked from the show notes. It's patreon.com/ontheledge. I will see you soon for my bonus episode on William Robinson. In the meantime, I hope you and your plants are thriving. Bye! The music you heard in this episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, The Road We Used to Travel When We Were Kids by Komiku, and Whistle by Benjamin Banger. All tracks are licensed under Creative Commons. Visit the show notes for details.